Hi, everybody. Welcome to the inaugural Academic-Led Publishing Day. I'm Cheryl Ball. I'm moderating this panel of esteemed panelists who I'm really excited to introduce in a moment. Just a little bit about me before we start. I'm the editor of Kairos. It's the longest running independent open access scholarly multimedia journal in the world, now entering its 24th year. Thank you to Kairos for letting us stream this broadcast from its YouTube channel. I also direct the Digital Publishing Collaborative at Wayne State University Libraries, where I'm working on Vega, a forthcoming academic publishing platform. And I'm really honored to have been invited to moderate this panel with some really cool people today, and I hope we have a fun conversation. And thank you for joining us to watch this live broadcast. Some of our panelists include journal editors, scholars, librarians, scholarly communication service providers, and nonprofit advocates for scholarly publishing. Unfortunately, it's flu season, so we're down a couple of panelists, including one of our university press members, but we hope to represent as many constituent voices as possible through the panelists' past and present experiences, and have time for some crosstalk among them as well. Before I introduce them, though, I'd like to thank the team of participating organizers who helped shape this panel for Academic-Led Publishing Day. Danielle Padula from Scholastica was amazing in helping me plan the logistics for this, as well as Melanie Schlosser from Educopia, Chelsea Boley from Ubiquity Press, Mark C. Wilson from the Free Journal Network, Dmitry Zaitsev, an OA advocate in maths, and Philip Hess from Knowledge Unlatched. Our goal with this broadcast is to start a conversation on the what and the why of academic-led publishing, and to reach out to faculty members, scholars, and more librarians, publishers, and service providers who want to help open the possibilities of academic publishing to being academy-owned in whatever form that might take. And how we define academy-led and academy-owned is part of this conversation. So let me now introduce the panelists to you. We've got Rebecca Kennison, who is the Open Access Network co-founder. She's also executive director of KN Consultants, where she's recently drafted a new research agenda for the Association of Research and College Libraries. She's developed recommendations for publication ethics in the humanities and worked on the humane metrics in the humanities and social sciences, or the Humetrics HSS initiative. Thanks for joining us, Rebecca. We also have today Virginia Ginny Steele. She is the Norman and Armena Powell University Librarian at UCLA, where among other responsibilities, she advocates for sustainable scholarly communication practices, including open access practices. Brian Cody is here with us from Scholastica, where he is the co-founder and CEO. Scholastica is a web-based software platform for managing academic journals, including peer review and publishing tools. He's also a self-taught Ruby on Rails programmer, and he left his PhD program in sociology at the University of Chicago to start Scholastica. Pretty cool. We also have with us today Max Mosterd, who's head of operations and analytics at Knowledge Unlatched. Max continues working on his passion of making science and education more accessible to the wider public. And he's studied economics internationally and has published on bibliometrics and the pricing of scholarly content. Also joining us today, we have Mike Taylor, whose day job is a software engineer with Index Data, which specializes in open source library software. But in his spare time, he's an unfunded academic at Bristol University, specializes in vertebrate paleontology of the giant sauropod. You might be able to see one sort of behind him. Mike's a huge OA advocate, and we're happy to have him on the panel today. Finally, we have Hugh Thomas, editor-in-chief for Algebraic Combinatorics. He's a maths professor at the Université du Québec à Montréal, where he holds a Canada Research Chair. He's also the editor-in-chief, as I said, of the open access journal, now called Algebraic Combinatorics, after a 2017 split with Springer. So welcome all to all the panelists. I'm sure you were waving to everybody as I was reading your bios. And now we'll start with a bunch of questions that I hope you will take up and expand in the ways that you feel are important. And while we don't have a public Q&A going along with the broadcast right now, which we will be archiving on the Kairos YouTube channel, you can tweet along with us at AL Pub Day over here on Twitter, and we can follow up with some of the comments afterwards. So I'm going to start, panelists, with a question for y'all about what your investment in academic-led publishing is. So in other words, like, Yes, I read your bios, but what is it that actually brings you to the table of academic-led publishing? And as part of that question, maybe how do you define academic-led publishing? We've seen even a couple of definitions come across today that the Library Publishing Coalition has put out between academy-owned versus academy-led versus community-led, things like that. So I'm curious to hear how y'all are taking up this initiative on this special day in your own work and how you're spreading it out to other researchers. Rebecca, why don't we start with you?
Sure. My investment has to do with asking the question, how is academic publishing different from other kinds of publishing? Or should it be? And if it should be, how is it? And my answer, my start of an answer to that, really being very aware and cognizant of all the complexities that Melanie Schlosser and Catherine Mitchell laid out in their really great post on what do we mean by academy-led, academy-owned, community-led, community-owned, and so on, is really what is it that we think scholarly communication is, and what values do the academy bring, and how are we aligned with the mission of the academy? And is this a different kind of entity than trade publishing or other kinds of publishing the way they're done? I'm going to posit that it is, but maybe we can have that whole kind of conversation as well. The question that I've been struggling with about any of these terms, and I agree that that it's really important that terminology matters, and we tend to go down into rabbit holes of terminology that then only become like our own secret language for the initiated. I think green, gold, and platinum OA is among those, for example. That doesn't really mean anything to most people outside of the conversation. And I don't want academy-led, owned, whatever to become that kind of conversation as well, where there's only our conversations. That's part of my investment too. But I guess my question about this, to kick off this, is I don't know exactly what we mean by perhaps that we're not leading that the academy is not leading already, or at least being driven by the scholarly communication system that we currently have in place, where hiring, tenure, and promotion are primarily based on the widgets that we produce, and productivity is based off of publications. And does that now mean, and I'm just throwing that out there to be provocative because you can count on me to do that, what does that mean when we're talking about the academy when the system itself is driving the ways that we're doing what we're doing? And does that mean if we're not leading, who is leading and what is leading, and how do we think about that? So I didn't answer your question at all, Cheryl, but I lay out a bunch of other questions that maybe we can wrestle with.
I like it. I like it. Mike, do you want to take some of those up?
Yeah,
or start
absolutely.
Your own? Great.
Yeah. So my concern, I suppose, isn't so much with who's leading scholarly publication as who it's for and what it's for. So to me, I feel there's this, as academics, we have this fantastic, it's like a high calling to me. If it ever becomes just a job, then that's a real shame and we've lost something. And the reason that we exist as academics, the reason academia exists, is to create new knowledge and to share it with the world. So to me, everything is subsumed to that. So then it becomes, when you think about what's the purpose of scholarly publishing, well, it's to serve scholarship. It's to get the new knowledge that we create out there into the world. So the fact that it's been subverted into this thing that's largely a mechanism for enabling people to fill their CVs and in looking for jobs and promotions is a real tragedy. So to me, when I think about academic-led publishing or academic-controlled or owned, what I'm thinking about really is just the values of the academy driving the way that the information gets spread, rather than the values of commercial corporations.
Awesome. Thank you. Max, do you want to go take a stab at this next?
Yes, I hope you can hear me well because my connection wasn't too well. And
Yes,
otherwise,
okay.
shut off my video, Cheryl. That's fine. No, so I'm here from Unlatched, and we are helping initiatives, publishers, infrastructure providers with building open access business models. We are an intermediary between funders, institutions, and on the other hand, these initiatives. And we have actually helped, and I'll talk on that in more detail, to great scholarly-led initiatives to basically develop a sustainable open access business model. And we learn a lot from that. We also see many different characteristics of such partnerships compared to not academic-led partners. So, and when I say academic-led, I think that in our definition here is that the activity that is being carried out, the core service, basically is fully controlled by a scholarly community or a scholar in that sense. And that's exactly these two initiatives we help to grow into open access, which, like I said, I will touch upon later, have very interesting dynamics.
Thank you. Great. Brian, why don't you step in now?
Sure, yeah, I appreciate that. So first reason I'm on the panel, Scholastica, since we started, provide software for academic journals, but we've had the honor to work with some sort of really exciting academic-led projects. So when Tim Gowers was launching Discrete Analysis, and he wanted to work with Scholastica, we were pretty early. I mean, that's been, what, 3 or 4 years. And that has really influenced how I thought about, talking to editors like him, so mission driven for what a journal should be. And on some level, academic-led publishing, because of that, I think a lot about is in opposition to some of the things Mike mentioned, the costs of knowledge, and then control, especially for corporations. And when I think about the definition, I don't think I'm the deepest thinker on this, but a litmus test I use is, can a group of scholars fire their publisher? It's probably academic-led. Can a group of scholars choose to change the journal's funding model? That's probably academic-led. And for what we do, we think a lot about being a service provider. So can they choose to use us, but then choose to use something else? And then that supports academics and being in control of these journals and being able to sort of wrest that control from what we've seen, again, the centralized model. So that's what I think about.
Awesome. Hugh, I'd like you to speak a little bit to that maybe, and as a journal editor who has jumped ship, what brings you to Academic-Led Publishing Day?
Well, so prior to being invited to this, academic-led publishing was not really a phrase that I knew about. But obviously it's something that I was doing without being aware of it, because the editors-in-chief of the Journal of Algebraic Combinatorics decided that we wanted to take back control of our journal, and that of the journal that we felt was our journal in the sense that it was our labor, but legally it was the journal of Springer. And so we jumped ship, and with support from the Centre Mersenne in particular and other organizations, we now have a open access journal, and that's something that I am pretty happy about.
Awesome, thanks for being here. Jenny, why don't we finish this first question with you as a librarian? A lot of the academic-led and academic-owned publishing resides in the libraries. What is your take on this?
So my take is similar to Mike's take, and I think Hugh's take as well, which is from the library standpoint, we are buying back the access to a lot of the scholarship and research that's generated in the academy. And it just seems crazy to me that we're supporting faculty on campus, supporting the work that they do, but then they end up signing away the rights and giving commercial third parties control over them. So I really feel as though academic-led, academic-controlled, whatever phrase we use, should be an umbrella term for ensuring that the dissemination of the research and scholarship that comes out of the academy is open and driven by the desire to improve the world and to understand the world we live in. and not driven by this desire to sustain incredibly high corporate profits on the order of 35 to even 50%, I've heard. It feels, from the library's perspective, as though there's enough money in the system to come up with some ways of supporting the publishing that goes on without having to pay over and above into this high profit margin. So I think it's important for us, and where I'm personally invested is in trying to make a switch from paying through the nose, so to speak, commercial publishers, and to building the kinds of infrastructures that we need to have in the academy, and that's scholarly societies, that's individual universities, that's university presses, libraries. It's all the ways that information can be disseminated. We just need to really take back that responsibility and say it's ours and embrace it.
Thank you for sharing that. As somebody who is a reformed academic working in a library now, I see firsthand what you're talking about in terms of the millions and millions of dollars that research libraries spend on all of these publications to buy them back that our faculty members produce every year, and they produce them part of towards what Mike started us out with, talking about this higher calling of academia, and yet we need to be able to distribute this work in a way that doesn't require the universities to buy double and sometimes triple what they should be paying for these things. But I want to bring this back to kind of a simple follow-up question for each of y'all, for those of you who want to answer this. Is academic-led publishing, or whatever that phrase is, it sort of seems that y'all seem to be signaling as anti-corporate in sort of that monolithic publishing, big five publishing kind of way. Does academic-led publishing automatically equate to open access publishing?
Well, I'd like to ask the question slightly differently, if I could, which
Sure.
is, who is included and who is excluded when we're talking about academic-led or community-led publishing? Because of course, and you can speak directly to this as somebody who was working for a journal that was being published by a commercial entity, and now is running an open access journal, but he's still the same person doing scholarly work. So I'm not, again, I'm just going to spend the whole day not answering questions, but just like making them all much more complicated.
That's good. That's good.
But to start to get to the question that you asked, open access publishing, of course, is done by commercial publishers all the time. So how are we? What exactly? Yeah, who's in, who's out, who's included, who's not? Do we have definitions for that? Are there, really fine commercial players? Are there, really bad nonprofit players, and so on? We know the answer to that is yes. So I guess I want to perhaps drill down a little bit more on not whether it's open access or not, but again, going back to the question of values and mission alignment, and whether there's some way we might be able to frame something in those terms rather than in straight up business model terms.
Any follow-ups to that?
Yeah, to me, it does come down to control. So I slightly kind of pulled back when you suggested anti-corporate as being an element of this, and I'm really not anti-corporations at all. I'm very happy for corporations to make a profit, or even a big profit, provided they're doing that by providing a service that people buy freely because they think it's worth what they're spending. The problem we have in scholarly publishing is that a lot of the content is controlled. Whether that's by corporations or indeed by the academy, it would be a bad thing. If individual universities had control over the research that was produced by their scholars, I wouldn't support that either. It really is to do with releasing the results of scholarship to be freely available.
And I'll follow up. I also think the idea of, echoing Mike, but the idea of control is important. I think mean, this role of publisher, when it means owning the journal and guiding the strategic direction and making decisions about the funding model, I'd say that's not academic led. And I maybe that's controversial and I'm missing it. But it's different than saying, are they players? In the same way, you know, people use Microsoft Word or Google Docs. Okay, well, you're involved in corporations, but they aren't deciding whether you can, whatever, publish the document you wrote. Terrible analogy. But so I mean, I look at this and I do think, in the end, is the people who have strategic control over the journal, are they mission driven? I should even say, I guess, mission driven in relation to scholarship, not mission driven in relation to their separate values.
I might also have a good example here, because as an intermediary working with publishers, we also had the chance to work together with Language Science Press, which I would say is a leading book publisher in linguistics. And they had funding here in Germany, and basically needed a sustainable funding model for the future. And they were in discussions with us to see if we could help them. Well, that's exactly what we do, and we don't discriminate between any legal taxpayers whatsoever. And we found together with them a good model, basically allow them to transition to a 3-year program with us and raise funds from libraries worldwide, and they could still keep all control. The only thing that we just agreed upon between each other is that you guys, Language Science Press, you're the experts on publishing, on everything you do. They have great, innovative processes like open peer review. They are in, I would say, really leader in the field in terms of new ways of publishing. And the only thing we help them with, and that is something they strategically did, help them with the fundraising. And I think that kind of partnership, I think, is very healthy. It's a good partnership to also enable academic-led publishers in this context grow into open access models. For example, if they decide, for example, just like the journal, let's split it away to make this work.
If I could jump in, I'd like to go back to this question about commercial or anti-commercial and profit, because that's something that I think about a lot. I don't think that I'm, strictly speaking, anti-commercial, but I also think that profit should be reasonable. It shouldn't be huge. As somebody who works in a publicly, or at least partially publicly funded institution, it's hard for me to justify, when I think about the fact that the taxpayers of the state of California are essentially providing the funding that we use to buy access to these journals. It's really hard to justify the kind of profit margins that exist. And I think the research and scholarship does need to be open, needs to be out there. Commercial parties can be involved, but the profit has to be reasonable. And I think about some of what's been said about Plan S, and the fact that their desire is to have a reasonable profit margin. Now, that's really hard to define, what's reasonable, and what may be reasonable to me may not be reasonable to a lot of other people. But I think when we get up and are talking about profit margins of 30 to 50%, that's really not.
Yeah, not sustainable. Ginny, for viewers who don't know what Plan S is yet, do you want to give a little summary of that?
So Plan S is a plan that was put forward by funders in Europe. This would be primarily government funders that would require immediate open access publication, either through a journal or they're not so much interested in preprints, but their desire is immediate open access through publishers that will provide it. And again, the publishers, the idea is that they can have profits, but they need to be reasonable. That may be simplifying it too much, but
and that they're starting now, I guess, with primarily with articles, but there's also a book clause in there, I understand, that a lot of people aren't realizing is coming down the pike. But Mike, what did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd like to push back against that a bit, I'm afraid, Ginny, because I don't think, to me, the issue isn't profit, it's price. So if one publisher can publish an open access article and charge an APC of $1,000 and only makes a 10% profit on that, an article processing charge, yes, then that's one thing. But if somebody else will charge me $100 to do it, and they're taking 90% of that as profit, that's still a much better deal for me. So I don't think I need to get hung up on profit margins. What I'm interested in is how much it costs and how good a service is provided.
Well, I think from an individual author's perspective, that's a way an author would look at this. But as long as there are institutional budgets that are underwriting this, I think the institution has to look at what it can afford. And so I see in the budget that I have that there's tremendous pressure on all sides to control costs. And if more and more publishers are trying to increase their profit margins, that drives the prices up. There's inflation that happens every year that's generally exceeds the consumer price index, the general inflation rate, and we end up having to pay it. And it has meant that we're unable to do some of the other things in our institutions that we would like to do. So we're unable in a library to have the staffing levels that we'd like to have. We're unable to have the kinds of services that we'd like to have. In an ideal world, we're not as available or able to convert other materials into digital formats to increase access to those. So it's these downsides that I think about and the institutional pressures on it. And I mean, we can argue over profits. I just think it depends on, a lot depends on the chair one sits in.
And I think this is important. Mike, do you want to follow up with a clarification on that? Because you are coming at it. Y'all are coming at it from two different perspectives. And I think that's important to the academic-led nature of this conversation.
Yeah, I wonder whether I was unclear, because Ginny, I'm absolutely not saying that prices don't matter and that costs don't matter, and I'm very aware of library budgets. I'm saying that my concern is only about how much something costs, not about how much of that cost is profit margin and how much is absorbed in the publisher's costs.
Yeah, that makes sense. I hear you, and I think it's true. Although eventually, I think there's, if somebody's delivering the same publishing services for a lesser amount of money and profiting greatly, I think there will be more and more companies and others entering the marketplace that will probably begin to drive that profit or that excess down.
Yes.
Great. And I'll echo Bjorn Brems writes about this, the idea of if you have more independent journals, you also, because someone like, Elsevier, they have their internal tools and their internal process, and they have a monopoly over those journals, so they're not, there's not internal competition. And so the idea of having service providers leading to competition so that, to your point, I guess everyone's point, the price goes down. And so, it might be different plateaus, but, the idea of that because control is outside of the publisher or outside of the service provider, a journal could shop around, and that can lead to opportunities for competition, to lower prices. That is, I'll just note, one of the reasons I'm excited about academic-led publishing is it also is more people making decisions for journals versus a few people making decisions for sort of more than 50% of journals.
Can I just jump in on that a little bit, Brian, and say, yes, people can shop around, but I'd actually like to talk about the complexities, perhaps, of that shop around and the time and effort and why people stay with the publishers that they do rather than doing what you're suggesting or what Hugh has done, or even something like, let's assume that you work for a journal that is not outright owned by the publisher, which a lot of them are, but some of them aren't. Quite often, a clause is given to you as an independently owned publisher is, journal, is that you get to weigh in on the price increases year on year that a publisher will be doing. Have you negotiated that contract? And do you actually take advantage of that particular clause within the contract? I'm going to go out on a limb and say probably most people do not, right? And so I guess my question there is, what is the responsibility of editors and other scholars, in that way, in helping to address many of the problems and concerns that we're talking about here, whether it's profit cost or whatever the case may be. It's a question that I'm really, really interested in, and again, that I have no good answers for. Like, how do we properly educate, engage, and train individual authors to keep their rights, editors to invoke clauses where they could be part of the solution to keeping costs down, and so on.
Well, Rebecca, I was going to ask you that as a follow-up question.
Oh, well. So you've listed, I'm not answering any questions. I'm only asking more questions.
But you so far you've listed two things that individual scholars could do, either as editors or as authors, working with their publishing agreement to try and make sure that includes some sort of clause towards openness, towards access and availability, or editors working with their editorial contracts to make sure that there's not some weirdness about it. And but are there other suggestions that any of y'all would have for faculty editors, or in any part of this process, and sort of taking ownership back of their publications, or for scholars who are working independently as authors and don't know how to proceed with this academic-led initiative? Hugh, do you have any suggestions on that, since you've recently done this?
To
put you on the spot.
Yeah, right. Largely, I would say, I feel like for us, it's worked out well, and it was easier than we expected. So that's, come on in, the water's fine. It's doable, and there's lots of tools that there weren't, in the past. There are lots of tools to make it really very workable.
Yeah. I think a lot of, I'm very conscientious of all of the questions that Rebecca raised with her statement, and knowing as a journal editor myself, trying to figure out, well, how do I have this open access journal already, and it runs purely on this weird set of volunteer labor in the humanities, which is a set of disciplines that doesn't often get included in the discussion of academic-led publishing or open access publishing, even though there's a long tradition of it there, because there's not like APCs, article processing charges, and things like that in the same way. So I'm curious, in your case, Hugh, since you are working in mathematics and in the sciences, like how have readers of the journal accepted this transition from this commercial entity to the open access? And is your journal independent now?
Yeah.
Awesome. And readers have been totally okay with that transition?
Yeah, we think so. I've heard positive feedback. There's the thing that, a thing that we had hoped would happen that hasn't happened yet, is that Springer is still running their journal. They've recruited other people to be editors they've recruited some other people, some distinguished mathematicians. I feel like we have an editorial board that really reflects the composition of the discipline that we really work in. They have, some impressive names, but not the same kind of community-based group of people, I would say.
And values.
But they do.
Values.
Yeah, but they are running. They are continuing to run a journal, and so that's and well, it's a little bit hard to tell to what extent people are continuing to submit to them, because there was, of course, a bit of a backlog, and so they're still publishing some things that were submitted even while we were still still involved. So it's a little hard to tell how that's going to shake out eventually. It may be that there will just be two different journals that exist, which wasn't. I don't view that as the best outcome if that's what happens.
But wouldn't more publishing opportunities be better in the long run?
Well, I mean, no, in the sense that, well, no, if now there's, I mean, I would like to see, publishing unshackled, right? And so if, our attempts to unshackle algebraic combinatorics result in, okay, now there's a new journal that's great, that's, all open access and everything, but people are also still publishing in the old journal. So, Ginny still has to subscribe to it, then we haven't saved Ginny any money. And I would really like to save Ginny money.
Thank you.
I like that idea of Unlatched, yeah.
Yeah, I think this is also is bringing up some really interesting parallels with the lingua glossa conversation that happened in linguistics, which was when glossa started, it was the whole board went over, started glossa from lingua. But what happened within the community there was the community said, first of all, anyone who publishes within glossa will automatically, will consider that as if you had published in lingua, just in terms of tenure and promotion criteria. So that became a community statement that most of the, if not all of the big linguistics departments came on board to say that. But also the refusal of people to submit review and so on for lingua and do so for glossa. Also an important element that happened there. So there's a whole community, speaking of community, whichever word we wish to use after that, that I think is an interesting component to this conversation as well, and something that you're encountering, Hugh, that I think is in really interesting parallel with the lingua glossa discussion. Lingua is still trying to continue on as a journal, and glossa is doing quite well. So so we'll see how that all plays out. But fairly interesting disciplinary, perhaps differences or comparative. Hopefully it'll work out for you in the same kind of way, Hugh.
Yeah, thanks. So I do think, I mean, we were in touch with some people from glossa, so we kind of they were very helpful. I wanted to say that I want to say, sorry, I had some brilliant thing to say, and now it's all as it does.
I'll step in a second while you remember. Okay. As a journal editor, I was always nervous when there was going to be a new journal in the discipline to start up, and especially because in my particular discipline in rhetoric and composition, most of the journals were online and open access, and also publishing some form of scholarly multimedia. And so it was direct competition in many ways to Kairos. And that made me really nervous because I wanted to, for a long time, I felt ownership of that, which is embarrassing to say out loud, actually. I can't believe I just said that. But then I realized, like as a scholar, I needed way more, once I became editor of Kairos, I couldn't really, I can submit to Kairos as a peer-reviewed publication because it's divorced from me as editor, right? I just sort of oversee that process, and I have a managing editor who can do that, blah, blah, blah. But I needed other venues to publish in. So that's when I realized that I was like, oh, actually starting more and more and more of these venues is actually going to be very helpful for the scholarly landscape in my particular discipline, because the discipline already has a value base of accepting that there should be scholarly multimedia works out there that are peer reviewed and that we can publish them as articles, you know, the equivalent to articles, the intellectual heft of articles, I guess I should say. And I wanted more opportunities to be able to do that as a junior and also a senior scholar at the time. But then that leads us to needing the infrastructure, right? So it's been really nice over the last, well, for the last 20 years since, or more, since Open Journal Systems has been available. But since we've seen the rise of all of these other systems in the last 5 to 10 years for publishing, I'm hoping that more scholars take up the opportunity to start journals. As complicated as that is, like I don't recommend anybody just jump into it. But also too, as a scholar, I've made the decision to not review for journals that aren't open access. Because that's like Rebecca was mentioning with Lingua and Glossa, like, no, I'm not going to review for the top print journals in my field. Also because they do double anonymous peer review, and I'm not interested in closing any of the publishing process down. I want to open it up as much as possible. So that, I think that's another way that academics can start leading the revolution.
And maybe one thing I can add to that is that need academics leading the revolution. I think there's a lot of potential, as but we could see with Knowledge Unlatched, and we discussed with Language Science Press, we as a service provider for the funding side, how can we make this work? Because you basically need funding. That's, I think, one of the bigger questions whenever you decide to go away from a journal, or when you want to start something new. And it's very time consuming. Talking to libraries, funders all over the world, it's a big task. So, and that's what we are helping them with. And we thought, hey, why don't we use your network? Their linguistics, it's a pretty close network. They knew almost, well, the main people, I would say. And we started to work together on reaching out with the help of their network to contact the librarians. And everyone was doing that. And so we got to a big pool of money, which was enough to support the operations of Language Science Press to publish 30, 35 books a year. And that's also something I think that really is in the power of these academic leading organizations. They have such a strong community. And if you find a way to really activate everyone, you might also activate your librarian. And we have a librarian on the panel, so maybe, let's see what Ginny says. But actually, when libraries receive these messages from their faculty, they're more than happy to engage, to listen, to understand the model. So I think there's many opportunities for new initiatives, communities that are thinking of to of that strong sense.
Great, Max. You cut off just a little bit there at the end, but I think we got the gist of what you were saying. Jenny, I didn't know if you wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, I would say definitely the librarians that I know who are engaged in these issues really do want to find other ways of supporting publishing. And so new models that are being developed are of great interest to us. And I don't think there's ever going to be just one way of doing things, but I think we are eager to really be part of this and to stop. I mean, at UCLA, we spend about $8 million a year on journals. I would love to be able to spend even $1 million of that on supporting other kinds of open journal publication systems or other kinds of publishing, and the same for books as well. So I think it's very reasonable to look at what the library's budget is in purchase of materials and say, is there a way that we could tap this and create a whole ecosystem of scholarly publishing that really better matches up with our missions?
Rebecca, would you like to respond to that? Since I know you...
Yay missions, yay.
No, Rebecca will only ask another question though.
No, I actually, hey.
Only since I know you've done some work on publishing cooperatives.
So So it's an interesting and complicated question. I think Ginny can speak very much to the complications as well about what institutions can do by themselves in terms of moving money, but also the power of, and Ginny's at UCLA, so part of the UC system, but also just thinking collectively about how we move forward in terms of collective funding models. So I think those of us working within this environment have long been cognizant of the importance of the local versus the global, if I could put it that way, in terms of local priorities and what those local priorities might be, however you're defining local, and furthering the collective mission of the academy by thinking about collective models. Now, the more people you get involved, the more complicated things become, and this is why I totally understand why Knowledge Unlatched and other groups have gone, institution by institution by institution by institution to try to get funding. I'm wondering whether it's at scale and efficient system or not. I'm going to say no, but we don't really have ways to collectively and collaboratively come together and say who are the trusted agents that we could who could oversee properly the pooling of money, and how would that work, and who would what criteria are there for who would get funded, and how they would be funded, and at what level, and who needs money and who doesn't need money, and is there anyone who doesn't need money, even though Kairos runs on volunteer labor, that to, time is money, right? As we say, and so, and if you're expending your effort there, you're not expending your effort some other places, and looking at that whole entire ecosystem, complicated ecosystem, but thinking, and I do think this is, lots of really interesting and important work happening in libraries discussing what collective collections look like, and how that works and how that gets funded. And this is a world that Ginny knows extremely, extremely well. But I'm positing this as also part of this whole academy fill in the blankness that we're looking at. How do we do things more efficiently, effectively, and how do we spend our money well and wisely? And it's really important questions, and ones that we're really grappling with right now as we speak, in really very fascinating and interesting ways.
Yeah, I think that leads to another question that I wanted to raise. So thank you again for the segue about why now? Why is now the moment when we need to be focusing on academic-led publishing? It seems we've had this zeitgeist happening for a couple of years towards this. Yeah. So yeah, Mike, you had a response?
It isn't, of course. This isn't the moment. 25 years ago was the moment. So we've fumbled the ball atrociously.
Yeah, you're right.
I think it's about 25 years since Stephen Harned published his subversive proposal about making scholarly communications available for free. It's when the web was starting to take off. It's explicitly stated in Tim Berners-Lee's first email introducing the World Wide Web that its principal purpose is to enable the free sharing of scholarly information. And yet that's the one thing that the web hasn't really done since it got started, and it's supporting a million other things that Tim Berners-Lee never dreamed of, but not that. So we're so far behind the curve in academia, and as a community, we're both fantastically smart and astonishingly dumb. And somehow we've walked into this trap, and the coils have got tighter and tighter around us. So we are 25 years too late, but of course that doesn't mean that we're too late. We can break out of it. But it needs a lot more effort now, I think, than if we'd just got our brains in gear 25 years ago and just done it right from the start.
I like it. Who wants to respond to that? Are we too late?
I'll jump in, because I actually agree, and I have often thought about the conversations that we had in libraries 25 years ago, the serials crisis at the time, and wished that we had made more progress. But I think partially what had to happen was there had to be a transition from the print world to the digital world. And that has taken a while. And really, it hasn't caught on in all disciplines yet. I mean, we see the STEM fields as almost entirely online, digital now, but humanities, arts, even some of the social sciences are not there yet. So I think that's part of why now is, and why it has taken so long, as well as just this idea that there is technology that can enable this sharing, and we need to make a leap of faith in some ways to say, we're going to do this and we're going to make it happen. We're going to have the revolution and get this information out there. I just think there has been at least momentum building. But yeah, it would have been great to do this 25 years ago. I totally agree.
I'm going to say +1 or +1,000 or something on that, and say that yes. So the technology now allows us to do everything that we could possibly want to do, and what holds traditional forms and formats, and yes, there is still print for journals and for books. What holds us in place is, again, a system that privileges those particular outputs rather than other kinds of output. And I like to talk to the people who are involved in what I'm going to put in quotes, the preprint movement, because isn't that a quaint name? Preprint.
That's crazy, isn't it? It's got
Preprint.
two lies in one word.
There we are.
Printed, and they're not free anything.
Explain that. Define that real quick for us.
So preprint is, well, in its most strict sense, would be historically what you had before you went to print, right? So it would be the version that was submitted to the typesetter in order to be typeset, or perhaps even the proofs version, but not the final version that then went into print. And when people talk about preprint now, though, they're usually talking about versions of scholarly output, shall we say. I don't even want to say, a publication necessarily, a genre of some kind, but that they feel is ready to be shared more broadly. And maybe it'll continue to be changed and there will be different versions of this. And maybe that's just the only thing that somebody ever wants to put out there. But we have a very snapshot in time idea of what publishing is about. And there are these times like, this is before print. And it used to be, this is before print, this is in print, and this is out of print, and so on, that it was all about the print part. And this is where Ginny's absolutely right. What has changed now is the idea that we can make, whole entire movies on our phones, and that there are different kinds of ways of even communicating that don't have to do with print at all, that don't have to do with capturing that information and what gets to be rewarded or not. And so what counts as, even scholarly output, if you create a data set that everybody is using, that isn't rewarded in the same way as if I write an article about that data set. And so I think all those kinds of conversations are also happening at this time, which is the why now conversation. Like, what should count and why should it count and who counts it and in what ways does it count? And and software and I mean, you name it. And that's a really fascinating conversation that's happening at the same time. And how do we pay for that goes back to what you were asking earlier, Cheryl, which is why I'm really interested in collective funding of infrastructure for all of these things. Like, if we fund the infrastructure, cannot people then do whatever it is that they want to under whatever quality credentialing rubrics the community comes up with, right? So
Brian, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, it just makes me think about, so the question of why now, here's where I make all my real sociology friends cringe. But the idea of sort of, when you talk about like social movements, sort of like when do they seem to work and when do they not? When you said sort of why now, thought about this idea of sort of political action. And one of the big things people talk about in some of these different theories is political opportunity. And so one of the models has this idea of, okay, you need to build sort of collective consciousness. So people often have to go through a period of experiencing grievance. And I'll just note, I think the rise of the internet and the rising prices over this period has given a lot of pain for a long time. And so I mean, some level you can think of that as, okay, the pot's starting to heat up. Right. And one of the next steps is organizational strength. And, you know, I think about models like the Open Library of Humanities, or the consortium, and all the sort of various consortia, the Library Publishing Coalition, but, you know, a lot of these groups who are organizing, which I still think we're early in that. But I think what Plan S did, I think it created a political opportunity. So when you think about things like social movements, it's not just that things are bad, they've been bad for a long time. It's that something happens to create opportunity. And I'm probably way too optimistic, maybe here, not being sort of in Europe. But when I think about that, I think this could be something, and all the journals and publishers I've spoken with recently, I think have a sense that that could be a political opportunity that actually creates pressure that, you know, in 15 years, we might look back and say, okay, that was, the why now wasn't sort of a choice. It was, you know, a moment in a process where you had a tipping point. So even though it might feel like 25 years, okay, and there's a lot of complaints, something's really changed, I think that Plan S might be the best sort of both organizational strength, because it involved those national funders, and a political opportunity for everyone to rally behind. So I'm hoping the idea of academic-led publishing is not sort of why now, it's sort of a, you know, a indicator that it is now. But again, I feel like I feel like Plan S is so controversial about whether it's good, bad, whether it'll happen, but I do think there's at least that possibility.
Thank you. As we wrap up, we're almost at the end of our hour, so 20 seconds each. What do you think is like the biggest challenge or the biggest opportunity right now in academic-led publishing? Brian, we'll go back to you.
Sure, so 20 seconds. I think looking at all the great models that are out there, so people who have flipped journals, like Hugh, people who have done them sort of themselves, people working with university presses. I think one of the biggest opportunities is that there is this sort of proliferation of models that you can draw from, not have to sort of be out in the wilderness in the dark.
Awesome. Ginny, how about you?
So I would go back to Rebecca's point about working together collectively and building a community infrastructure. I think it's a great idea, great concept, but really hard to do.
Yeah. Hugh, how about you? Oh, we've muted you. Hold on. I'll come back to you. Max?
No, I muted you.
Oh, you got it? Okay.
Yeah.
There we go.
Right. Sorry. I think that the model that we have seems to be working okay for small journals that are where there's a sense of community, and there's and the scale is not too big. And I think we need to think really hard about how to get it working for sort of big journals.
Scale, yeah, awesome. Max?
Yeah, I want to say that global coordination, I think, is really the key in different dimensions. Library funding, general funding, coordination amongst communities, large journal communities, global coordination, I think, is a big challenge.
Great, yep. Mike, how about you?
When an animal raised in captivity is released into the wild, a thing that often happens is they open the cage door and the animal just sits there. It doesn't walk out. It's got no mental model for what freedom is like. That's the situation for a lot of us, I think, and journal editors particularly. Sometimes even when they're offered a costed way of transitioning to open access, often they don't want to jump. So somehow we've got to address that psychological issue.
Awesome, thanks. Rebecca, last word?
Engaging academics. Individually, collectively, and in every way is crucial to the success of this.
Yes.
We have to engage the academics.
Thank you all so much for joining me. All you panelists have been phenomenal. Thank you to everyone who's been watching the broadcast. We will archive this on the Kairos YouTube channel. We'll provide a full, complete transcript of this with links out to a bunch of the things that were mentioned, like PlanS and the different organizations that we've mentioned. So you can follow up with more information as you'd like. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.